legislative acts related to slavery that occurred in the decades prior to the Civil War in the 1860s. I'm doing this to help provide context for the maps you're about to see. These maps didn't come out of nowhere. There was a context, an historical context, for why they were created. Next, I'm going to cover the slavery maps themselves that were produced in the 1850s, decade before the Civil War, and these maps were privately produced. And then I'm going to cover slavery maps produced during the Civil War by the Union government, and finally I'm going to have some conclusions. So first, maps are not real. And actually, I'm just saying this to be provocative, but the reason I'm saying this is that the physical maps as objects are real, but the maps themselves are abstractions of reality. And you can almost say that they're models. They represent the Earth. So abstractions are necessary due to projecting a three-dimensional surface, i.e. a globe, onto a two-dimensional surface, i.e. a sheet of paper. So map projections will introduce distortions to maps in regard to shapes, areas, distance, and direction. You can't have it all. No projection is going to give a map that provides accurate shapes, areas, distances, and directions all in one map. So a map projection is selected based on the goals of the map user. For example, the famous Mercator projection distorts area, shape, and distances badly as you approach the poles, but navigators can chart accurate bearings on it, so it's popular with sailors. It's a counter projection and unfortunately gets misused. Look at how large Greenland appears in this general map of the world. Greenland looks much larger than it really is. Scale determines the level of detail in a map and the aerial extent of a map. Maps are not drawn at a one-to-one scale. They would not be useful at that scale. A map of the city of Erie would essentially be the size of Erie. And again, that would not be very useful. It's not kind of be put in your pocket. So thus we have maps at different scales. Large scale maps, large detail, small area covered. For example, the map of the city. Again, very detailed, but covers a small area. Small scale maps, small detail, but large areas covered. So these include world maps, maps of continents, countries, etc. So all the maps we're going to be talking about today, they're going to be small scale maps, maps at the national or state scale. And one thing I did want to show you, I showed you Greenland earlier and how large it was displayed in a Mercator projection. Now here's a map that shows the world Mercator projection with the actual country sizes superimposed. Look at how small Greenland really is, and look at how small Russia is. So during the Cold War, propagandists would use the Mercator projection to make Russia look a lot larger than it really was, to make it look more menacing. And I remember when I was in elementary school, even high school, all the school maps on school walls had maps in the Mercator projection, and they all looked like what was on the previous page, where Greenland looked like that. So, the other thing, maps are not neutral. Maps are created by humans, and their creators' perspectives, values, and interests can influence the map's content and presentation. Maps simplify complex realities, choosing to highlight some features while omitting others, which can lead to a skewed or incomplete representation. Maps can be used to make political arguments or promote specific viewpoints, so understanding the map's purpose and context is crucial. This is all to set the context for the maps we're about to see. But before I get to the maps themselves, there are three important legislative acts related to slavery that I want to briefly touch on: the Missouri Compromise of 1820, the 1850 Compromise, and the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854. I'm only going over these briefly, but it's important to go over them since they provide context, again, for the maps that were created during that period. So the Missouri Compromise of 1820. So in 1820, there were roughly 1.5 million slaves in the slave states. The total population of the United States was roughly 9.6 million. Thus, 15% of the population were slaves. So there's a balance in the U.S. Senate of free states and slave states at 11 each. Missouri was due to enter the Union, and a debate ensued about whether Missouri was going to be a free or a slave state. This was highly debated because admitting Missouri was going to upset the delicate balance in the Senate. Senator Henry Clay of Kentucky came up with a compromise that allowed Missouri to enter the Union as a slave state, while Maine entered the Union as a free state. Thus, the balance of free and slave states was maintained. Also, the act drew a line from east to west across the 36th parallel but to be precise, 36 degrees 30 minutes, dividing the nation into competing halves, half free, half slave. This line went as far west as the furthest extent of the Louisiana Purchase. The provisions of the Missouri Compromise forbid slavery in the former Louisiana Territory north of this line. So from 1820 to 1850, slaves entered the Union and freed slave state pairs in order to continue the balance between free and slave states. So 8 states remained in the Union in the period between 1820 and 1850. Missouri and Maine, 1820 and 1821, Arkansas and Michigan, 1836, 1837, Texas and Florida and Iowa and Wisconsin, 1845, 1848. So again, this whole area labeled the unorganized territory, that was what was covered under the Missouri Compromise line. This line did not go beyond that point. So it's really just this area right up there. And when you look at it, Missouri, the midst of slave state, that was sort of a compromise in its own right because that is north of that boundary line. Again, Missouri is allowed to enter provided that Maine continues a free state. So the compromise in 1850, there were about 3.2 million slaves in the slave states. The slave population had doubled in 30 years. The total population in the United States was now 23 million. Thus, roughly 14% of the population in the United States were slaves. The United States gained vast tracts of land out west beyond Louisiana Purchase as a result of the war with Mexico from 1846 to 1848, and new territories were created. Debate then ensued about what to do about slavery in those territories. The sectional divide threatened to tear the country apart, but through the efforts of Senator Henry Clay and Illinois Senator Stephen Douglas, a compromise was reached that dampened tensions temporarily. This compromise became known as the Compromise of 1850 and had 5 provisions. First, California's Munis a free state. 2, established Utah and New Mexico territories with no restrictions on slavery. Popular sovereignty would decide the slavery issue when they became states. In other words, the people in those territories would decide for themselves whether they would be slave or free. 3, it determined the northern and western borders of Texas. 4, in Washington, D.C., the slave trade was prohibited, but slave ownership was maintained. And 5, strengthened the fugitive slave laws with the Fugitive Slave Act. And finally, the last act, before we actually show you some maps, the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854. And this was probably the most influential of the 3, which really started moving us towards Civil War. So shortly after 1850, population pressure continued to push westward, resulting in new territories being created, which eventually lead to adding more states to the Union. Another important issue in this time period was the construction of a transcontinental railroad. The Illinois Senator Stephen Douglas was favoring a northern route that would run through Louisiana Purchase territory. But in order to get the northern route, he would need the support of the southern states, which meant that Douglas had to favor removing the restrictions on slavery in that territory. Remember, this territory was banned from slavery based on the 1820 Missouri Compromise. Thus, Senator Douglas introduced the Kansas-Nebraska Act in January 1854. The major provisions were that Nebraska and Kansas territories were created. Again, these were created in Louisiana Purchase territory. So these territories, again, were created from Louisiana Purchase territory. Again, under the 1820 Missouri Compromise, by law, these territories became states. Slavery would not be allowed. But this act would change that. Popular sovereignty would decide for each territory whether slavery would be permitted or not within their borders. This meant that the residents of their respective territories would vote on whether they wanted to permit slavery or not. It was essentially a local referendum. So now, the introduction of the Kansas-Nebraska Act on January 23, 1854 by Stephen Douglas was a lightning rod to anti-slavery activists in the North. They argued that this act was a direct violation of the Missouri Compromise of 1820 that prohibited the slavery in the Louisiana Purchase territory. Ohio Senator Salmon Chase, with other Ohio Democrats, wrote a lengthy appeal against this bill to the American people, which appeared in numerous newspapers. In this appeal, there's mention of maps. He says, "Take your maps, fellow citizens, we entreat you, and see what country it is which this bill gratuitously and recklessly proposes to open to slavery." So the first map we're going to talk about is the Colton map. So Senator Chase did not have to wait long for maps to be brought to bear in opposition to proposed Kansas-Nebraska Act. 3 days after the bill was introduced, 3,000 protesters gathered at the Broadway Tabernacle in New York City to oppose the bill. Many speeches were made, but the star was a prop that was center stage, a giant map made by cartographer George Colton. New York Times reported that, quote, the front of the choir in the rear of the pulpit was illuminated by a row of lights, intended to display the proportions of a large and handsome map of the United States and the territories, prepared for the occasion by Mr. Colton. The map was printed upon a white canvas and displayed the relative sizes and proportions of the states and territories. A heavy black line is drawn entirely across its face from the Atlantic to the Pacific, representing the latitude of 36 degrees and 30 minutes, the line which defines the limitations imposed by the Missouri Act. The new territory and Nebraska was indicated in its appropriate place as proposed in the bill providing for its organization. Now, one thing when you do read what was printed in the New York Times, heavy black line is drawn entirely across its face from the Atlantic to the Pacific, representing latitude 36 degrees 30 minutes. The line which defines limitations imposed by the Missouri Act. That's not true. If you remember, this is the limits. It didn't go all like the Pacific Ocean. But on that map that was displayed on Colton map, January 30th, 1854, he drew the line. It says here from the Atlantic to the Pacific. So that was for effect. So anyway, just want to point that out. Now, Colton's map that was used at the Broadway Tabernacle does not exist anymore. No one really knows what happened to it, but we could have built what it looked like. Colton immediately adapted his map for publication, and it appeared in various forms in northern newspapers across the country. Here's a version that was published in 1854 for the New York Independent. So the intent of this map was to startle readers. First of all, the shading of the territories is meant to be very similar to the slave states, even though the issue of slavery is to be solved by popular sovereignty later. The implication that these territories will become slave states. The map shows the Northeast and Upper Midwest states surrounded with and by potential slave states. The Eastern and Midwestern free states would also be separated from the West altogether. So the New York Independent was willing to share the map with other newspapers. We have preserved, and says, they stated, we have preserved the engraved block and can furnish stereotype casts like that which we now use for $2 each to any paper that desires to aid in diffusing to the community the correct idea of the extent of monstrous iniquity that is now being proposed. Now, despite the protests in the northern newspapers in the early part of 1854, the Kansas-Nebraska Act became law on May 30, 1854, after 3 debates in the Senate and the House. So while the Union is preserved, the sectional divide continued to grow. Abraham Lincoln, former Illinois congressman and candidate for Illinois State's House, and Senator Stephen Douglas had debates about slavery, in particular popular sovereignty, in September to October 1854. Douglas preached in favor of popular sovereignty and Lincoln against. Now, these were not the famous Lincoln-Douglas debates. Those occurred later in 1858, and Abraham Lincoln was running for Senate. But these debates served as a precursor to what was to come. And these were not formal debates where Lincoln and Douglas shared a stage for arguing face-to-face. As Douglas was giving speeches around the state of Illinois, Lincoln was sort of wow on and giving impromptu speeches following Douglas's speeches. So these speeches, for the most part, were not well documented, but again, they set the stage for the 1958 formal debates. A very important outcome of the Kansas-Nebraska Act was the creation of the Republican Party, which would later become the party of Abraham Lincoln when he was elected president in 1860. So John Jay was the grandson of the first Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, also named John Jay. He was one of the founders of the Republican Party. In 1854, he was a noted New York abolitionist. So 2 years after the passage of the Kansas-Nebraska Act, in October 1856, John Jay gave an address in Bedford, New York, titled America Free or America Slave, an address on the state of the country. The New York Tribune published the 20-page address, which included a map designed by John Jay himself. In addition to the map, there is marginalia that disclosed the number of slaves in the United States and how the slave population affected congressional representation. The map states that the slave states have 30 members in the House of Representatives based on the slave population. Regarding the Constitution, counted slaves as 3/5 of a person. That was counted towards apportionment for the House of Representatives. So on page 9 of this address, John Jay argues what the map shows. Now look at the map, blackened by slavery. You'll see that Kansas is the key to the large territories to the west of it. The boundless regions of Utah and Mexico, extending hundreds of miles till they meet the eastern boundary of California. Is it not clear that if we lose Kansas, we shall in all probability lose not only the Indian Territory lying south of it, but these vast territories stretching to the westward, and large enough to make more than 6 states the size of Pennsylvania. So the map goes beyond Colton's and uses statistics from the 1850 census in order to make its points. Jay uses the census data to argue that a southern oligarchy has too much influence over the northern white population. He also uses the census data to show how slavery affects representation in Congress. Now, John Jay's map was also used verbatim in the 1856 Life of John Charles Fremont, published by the editors of the New York Tribune. And I guess here's a trivia question. Why was the biography of John Fremont significant in 1856? Why would a biography of John Fremont be significant in 1856? And the answer to that is he was the presidential candidate, Republican presidential candidate in 1856, who ran against James Buchanan. So in this biography of John Charles Fremont, they included that John Jay map as an argument against slavery extension in Indian territories. So the 1856 presidential campaign was dominated by the question of whether or not to repeal the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854. So Democratic candidate James Buchanan supported the act and John Fremont was against it. So the main issue was expansion of slavery, which worried those fighting to contain or abolish slavery. So John Jay's maps and others like them appear in newspapers, posters, handbills, pamphlets, and campaign biographies, just as the one we saw for John Fremont. So another map that's motivated by 1856 election, this is the Blast map. This map, the accompanying text, was created by William C. Blotz. He was a noted social reformer and one of the founders of the anti-slavery movement. He was also an early temperance advocate and active in the women's suffrage movement. So in 1843, he published an early anti-slavery newspaper called The Rights of Man. He was active in the Underground Railroad. His home in Rochester, New York, was a stop on the railroad. So this particular map was common in 1856, but very few exist now. This is a very rare newspaper-style broadside with only 3 copies found in university collections. There's no copy at all in the Library of Congress. So this specific map is a 4th edition, so there's definitely a demand for this map in the North, especially in Rochester. Watts was known to personally travel around the northern states and distribute this map and advocate for abolition. He also distributed this map to the newly formed Republican clubs near Rochester. So a closer look at this map shows some similarities to the Colton map and Jay maps that we just saw. The slave states are colored in black, the territories in question are in gray, and northern states are in white. Northern free states are in white. The text is extremely provocative. It starts with the title, Map of the United States and Territories Showing Possessions and Aggressions of the Slave Power. There's provocative language in Bloss's text that describes the color scheme. He describes the dark color is used to show the threatened conquest of the territories. And the map itself is used some type of projection that enlarges the threatened territories. To the right is text that says, to clubs. The Young Men's Republican Club of Rochester say, quote, it has been put up in the workshops and close places in the city, wherever the people do most congregate. Clubs should purchase it at wholesale and hang it on the wall of every sincere inquirer about the truth. And seek here. And if you look at the bottom of the map, it uses statistics from the 1850 census to buttress its claims against spreading slavery to the Western territories. The text challenges the Three-Fifths Compromise, which counted 3 out of the 5 slaves towards determining Southern political representation while denying those enslaved peoples any voting privileges or freedom. So while this map was popular in the North, it was banned in the slave states. So I'm also presenting at the bottom a newspaper article in the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette dated August 22nd, 1856, that describes William Bloss traveling to Pittsburgh to sell his map and tells of the reaction some people had to the map. The article states that this map makes the Buccaneers, and the Buchananites, very mad, so mad that one of them committed a personal assault on him yesterday while offering them for sale. Now here's another 1856 presidential campaign map by William S. Reynolds, appropriately titled Reynolds' Political Map of the United States. That's a long title. The comparative area of the free and slave states and the territory open to slavery or freedom by the repeal of the Missouri Compromise. And we need to edit that down a little. That's a long title. But it's a lot like book titles nowadays. They really, they have the main line, and they have something that follows. So this map differs from previous maps with dramatic use of color. Using pink for the free states differs strongly from the green that was selected for the territories in question. The green actually aligns more closely with the gray shade of the slave states. Thus, the impression is given that the territories are likely to become slave states. The Kansas territory is left white to indicate that Spain was currently being debated and in question, and a white line highlights the Missouri Compromise line. Also, the map projection that was used for the meridians convergence to the north reduces the size of the free states and makes the slave states appear larger. Like the previous two maps, this map also makes exclusive use of the 1850 federal census but with even more detail. The text on the map describes an unfair advantage that the slave states have in terms of racial representation and postal expenditures. The other item of note that makes this map political are the portraits of Republican nominees, the President and Vice President John Fremont and William Dayton. This map was rushed into print quickly after John Fremont's nomination. And when the map came out, they issued the following advertisement in the New York Times, New York Tribune. It says, "Now ready, Reynolds political map of the United States, size 29 by 31 inches, showing at a glance the whole country from the Atlantic to the Pacific coast, colored so as to designate the free and slave states. Also, the vast territory lies open to freedom or slavery. It also presents a vast amount of statistical matter showing the advantage of freedom over slavery. The map was issued both in sheet form for 25 cents and it's a pocket map for 50 cents. So, this map is very rare and seldom seen on the antique market. I actually did query this on Google, and I actually tried to find this map, and they have been for sale in the past, but not like now. It should be able. Now, despite all these maps, John Fremont was defeated and James Buchanan became our 15th President of the United States. And during this term, the sectional divide continued to widen. So I'm not going to spend much time here, but I'm just going to go over some of the highlights. So between 1856 and 1861, Kansas was a hotbed to the slavery debate. Violence ensued over whether Kansas would be a free or slave state. And after numerous votes by the Kansas population, Kansas came down on the side of free state and was admitted to the Union in 1861. In 1857, the Supreme Court ruled on the Dred Scott case, determining that 1, blacks were not citizens, 2, that slavery could not be prohibited in the territories, and 3, that the 1820 Missouri Compromise was unconstitutional. And this, of course, really lit a fire under the abolitionist movement in the North. Was met with approval in the slaveholding states. Abraham Lincoln, Republican, and Stephen Douglas had their debates regarding slavery during the 1858 Illinois Senate race. And these debates covered the events in Kansas and the Dred Scott decision. And even though Lincoln lost the election to Douglas, the debate put Lincoln on the political map. And finally, abolitionist John Brown and fellow guerrillas attempted to seize the federal armory at Harper's Ferry, Virginia, and failed. It was his goal to take the seized weapons and use them to arm a servile insurrection. He and his followers were captured and tried in Virginia. He was found guilty of murder, inciting servile insurrection, and treason in Virginia, and was hanged. He became a martyr to the abolitionist movement and a base villain to the slaveholders. Yes?
So I would like, you were saying the maps are so rare. Where are they at now?
Well, some of these are in the Library of Congress. Like there's no one that wasn't, but that one is definitely the Library of Congress. I saw it there. But in the private market, they're rare.
Oh,
They need to be private owners. They make some museums have them, but there's really not many of them around. But privately owned by collectors. So I didn't see your hand earlier.
No, I just
raised it now. Okay. All right. So the 1860 presidential race is beyond the scope of this talk, but it's sufficient to say that the anti-slavery Republican Abraham Lincoln was elected president in November 1860, and immediately southern states began to secede. Between the time he was elected in November 1860 to his inauguration in February 1861, 7 states from the Deep South had seceded. The states in blue, South Carolina, Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas. And after the firing for Sumter in April 1861, and President Lincoln's subsequent call for troops, 4 more states seceded, the states in gray, Virginia, Arkansas, North Carolina, and Tennessee. four border slave states staying in the Union, the states in light blue, Missouri, Kentucky, Maryland, and Delaware. So now we're going to get to the next set of maps, the government-produced slavery maps. So Americans by 1860 were now familiar with slavery maps from what they had seen in the 1850s. The slavery maps made in opposition to the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854 started the trend, followed by the slavery maps made in the 1856 presidential election. But the bottom line is that this representation of slavery was very simplistic. Just binary representation. The states were colored based on whether they were free or whether they were slave states. No attempt was made to capture in the map numerical difference in the number of slaves in a slave state. Numeric information about number of slaves per state was included in the tables attached to the maps, but was not captured in the maps themselves. So this binary representation was about to change based on new slave numbers from the 1860 federal census. I just wanted to show you, sort of quickly, an example of what the slave census looked like in 1860. There's a special schedule for it, called Schedule 2. And this is what was filled out by the census enumerators in 1860. This is a page out of the census for the Adair County, Missouri. This form was filled out on June 2nd, 1860, and it has the signature of the enumerator in the upper right. And the form contains the name of the slave owner and then lists each slave for that owner, but not by name. So for each slave, the age, sex, and color is collected. B stands for black, M for mulatto. And finally, on the far right, the number of slave houses for that owner is collected. At the bottom of the page with summary statistics for that page for Adair County, number of male slaves and number of female slaves. And then when all that was tabulated, it came out and was printed. This is what was published actually by the Census Bureau, and this is the national table for the census of Missouri for Adair County. And this is the type of, just that one that I have outlined there, that's Adair County, but that's the all the counties in Missouri. So this is the type of census data that was used to make the maps that we're going to see coming up. When all the data was tabulated for the 1860 census, number of slaves in 1860 was nearly 4 million slaves. So let's look at the premier U.S. government mapping agency at that time, who's going to make the maps we're going to look at. The U.S. Coast Survey was established in 1807 by President Jefferson to create accurate navigational charts of the nation's coastline and harbors. In the late 1850s, many leaders in government could see the potential for coming war, and the superintendent, Alexander Bach, was one of these men. So starting in 1858, under his supervision, the Coast Survey concentrated on mapping coastal and river areas that could be sites of potential naval conflict. So these sites included the Delaware and Chesapeake Bays, important rivers in Virginia, the southern coast, Mississippi River, and the Texas coast. He even recalled surveyors from the West Coast so the agency could devote itself to mapping these important locations. So these maps were incredibly labor-intensive, requiring engineers to perform triangulation, measure bathymetry, and capture important topographic features. And all of this collected data then had to be converted into detailed charts by the cartographers. So this is a portion of one of the maps that was made in 1858 of the entrance to Charleston Harbor. And on this excerpt, we can see Fort Moultrie, it's up there, and Fort Sumter down there. So Fort Moultrie, where the federal troops were stationed in early 1861, and we also see Fort Sumter, where they moved to after they evacuated Fort Moultrie in April 1861. So as you can see, this is a very detailed nautical chart that would be very useful to any mariner attempting to navigate these waters. So this map is a good example of the traditional types of charts that the U.S. Coast Survey was making prior to and during the Civil War. But in June 1861, the U.S. Coast Survey cartographers compiled a very different type of map. This type of map had not been seen before. It's called a choropleth map. Now, we've seen them a lot now. We're used to seeing choropleth maps, maps that are color-coded based on various categories. But back in 1861, this is a brand new map. Nobody had ever seen a choropleth map before. And this U.S. Coast Survey produced them. So this map was published just 1 month after Virginia seceded from the Union, and this map was drawn by cartographers at the U.S. Coast Survey, and it depicts the population density of slaves in Virginia. Now, this map does not identify the Coast Survey as the source, but the map includes the name Edwin Hergesheimer, who had worked with the survey since the 1850s, and 1861 was the head of the drafting division. Prior to the Civil War, the few existing maps of Virginia covered county boundaries and railroads, topography, internal improvements, and hydrographic surveys. So this statistical map is probably the first map of Virginia to show the distribution of the slave population, and is certainly one of the first thematic maps made of the state. So in all likelihood, the coast surveyors took an existing county map of Virginia and then applied new shading techniques to identify slavery according to new census figures. This map is different from the previous slavery maps that we have seen in several ways. First, the scale of the map is larger and more granular. The previous maps were national maps with the states as a unit of measurement. This map of Virginia has counties as a unit of measurement. Larger scale, larger detail. The other difference is that the previous maps indicated the presence of slavery again as a binary measurement. Either a state was free or a slave. This map shows the percent of the population for each county that's composed of slaves. So we're able to see a gradation in the distribution of slaves across the state of Virginia. The darker the grayscale, the higher the percent of population that is slaves. Again, these maps are quite common now, and they're called choropleth maps, but back in 1861, these were brand new.
Are they what does that?
Choropleth? Choropleth?
Oh, plet.
Choropleth.
Choropleth.
That's Choropleth. Probably should have put that up there somewhere, but they're called choropleth maps.
Let's see.
Not again, what I showed you, it's probably hard to see, so I'm just going to zoom in on some parts of it so you sort of see what's significant here. In the upper right and moving clockwise, we have the title of the map and the date and location of publication. In the upper left, the map provides tabular data from the 1860 census that shows for each county the number of whites, the number of slaves, and then the percentage of the population that are slaves. Now, the order is not in alphabetical order. The order is based on the percent of the population that is slave. Thus, Nottoway County is listed first, with 74% of its population is slave. The lower left shows this map was sold for the benefit of the sick and wounded of the U.S. Army. Next, we have a scale which most maps will have so that distances can be measured. And finally, we have drawn by E. Herdersheimer, who was the lead cartographer at the Coastal Survey. How was this map used? First use of this map was a fundraiser. Funds were used again to support the sick and wounded of the U.S. Army, but it was also used to show that in 1861, even though seceded Virginia was classified as a slave state, the distribution of slaves was definitely not uniform across the entire state. So it's clear that the western portion of Virginia had very few slaves, and that this area could be viewed as a potential pocket of Union support. The Tidewater and Piedmont area to the east were more heavily slave-oriented, with slavery diminishing as you move west through the Shenandoah Valley. Now, this map was reissued 4 months later in September 1861, and there's one significant difference in this issue. This map identifies the western half of Virginia as Kanawha, one of the original names for the proposed new state and an implicit endorsement of its political independence. So after a series of conventions in Wheeling, later in 1861 and 1862, the new state was created. It was not named Kanawha, but rather West Virginia, and most certainly this map was consulted. Due to overwhelming demand, the Coast Survey published 3 editions of this map of Virginia. And again, you can see why West Virginia became a state. The percentage of slave population in those counties is nearly non-existent. Now, this map is not a map from the period, but I wanted to include it. It was produced by the Library of Virginia. And this map used the 1861 Virginia slavery map as a base map and superimposes the residence of the delegates who voted for and against secession in April 1861. So the blue dots indicate those who voted against secession, and yellow show those who voted for secession. And we can readily see that the western part of the state that had little slavery was heavily Unionists. Now, this is the type of display you might see in a modern geographic information system, which facilitates overlaying geographic information on top of each other for spatial analysis. Now, this map. In September 1861, the U.S. Coast Survey, again under Edwin Herdersheimer, compiled this map. This map shows the distribution of slave population by county in the southern states. Note that this map does not just show the slave distribution in the states that seceded, but also shows the slave distribution for the slave states that stayed loyal to the Union: Missouri, Kentucky, Maryland, and Delaware. So this is a large map. The dimensions are 34 by 27.5 inches. And let's look at some of the components of this map like we did the other one. It's essentially it contains much the same information as the Virginia map, but there's one thing that is a bit different. And if you look to the far right, we see scale of shake.
Oh, God.
That would have been very helpful for the map of Virginia. That didn't have that, didn't have a legend. So what you would have had to do was actually, all you knew was that it was darker, there was a heavier concentration of slave population, was lighter, less of a slave density. Here they actually tell you what the colors represent, which is quite an improvement over the Virginia map. And again, just like the Virginia map, this one actually has by states the free population, slave population, total, and other percents. And this, again, is also sorted by the highest percentage of slaves. So this data table shows that for the southern states, the free population, the slave population, total population, percentage of slaves, from this table will be seen that the total number of slaves in the United States in 1860 was nearly 4 million, or 32% of the total population in the United States. South Carolina had the largest percent of 57.2%. And it should be noted that the 4 slave states with the lowest percentage of slaves that stayed in the Union, they class the C. So Kentucky, Maryland, Missouri, and Delaware, again, lowest percentage of slaves, they stayed in the Union. Now, could we use this map? Well, we know there's one power who used this map, and that person was President Abraham Lincoln. He was taken with this map the moment he saw it, and he consulted it often. How do we know this? This is Francis Bicknell Carpenter. He personally believed that Abraham Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation that in January 1863 freed slaves in the rebel southern states was an act unparalleled for moral grandeur and achieving mankind. He wanted to capture in a painting the moment that President Lincoln presented his cabinet with the first draft of the proclamation. So Carpenter gained permission to move into the White House to research, draft, and complete his painting. So Carpenter spent 6 months living in the White House from February to July 1864, and he captured his experience in a book that he published in 1866. Not surprising, it's titled 6 Months at the White House with Abraham Lincoln, the story of a picture. So Francis Carpenter arranged to have Lincoln and the cabinet photographed individually twice, once in Matthew Brady's studio and again in the White House cabinet room. So Carpenter, on February 9th, went with President Lincoln to Matthew Brady's studio to have photographs taken. This photograph actually was later used to create the etching for Lincoln's image on the $5 bill. That has nothing to do with the map, but I just threw it in there because I was English today. While at the White House, Carpenter interviewed Lincoln and other cabinet members at length about the cabinet meeting where Lincoln presented his draft for the first time, the Emancipation Proclamation. He then spent a lot of time sketching the cabinet room and tried to capture the room as accurately as possible for his painting, including the crimes. And this is the final result of 6 months' work. This is Carpenter's representation of Lincoln's historic first reading of the Emancipation Proclamation. The cabinet is seated all around the president as he presents his draft. But in addition to the cabinet are also 2 other items of interest: maps. If you look closely to the far lower right, you will see the 1861 slavery map of the southern states that I just covered. Also, if you look closely, there's another map, the slavery map of Virginia. There it is right there. That I also just covered. So Carpenter placed both of these in the painting for their symbolism regarding slavery, but also for another reason. Carpenter observed President Lincoln using these maps, and particularly the slavery map of the southern states. In his memoir, Carpenter states that during the 6 months at the White House, he found Lincoln on more than one occasion poring over the map. He was using the map to trace the military maneuvers and connecting those actions to his policy of emancipation. So from his memoir, Carpenter says, "Wishing to introduce this map into my picture, I carried it off one day without the president's knowledge. And as the copying of it was a tedious affair, it remained in the studio for some time. This chanced to be during the week of Kilpatrick's great cavalry raid in Virginia. One afternoon, the president came in alone, as was his wont, the observation of the daily progress of the picture appearing to afford him a species of recreation. Presently, his eye fell upon the map, leaning against a chair as I had left it after making the study. 'Ah,' said he, 'you have appropriated my map, have you? I've been looking all around for it.' And with that, he put on his spectacles and taking it up, walked to the window and sitting down upon the trunk and began to pore over it very earnestly. So that is how he observed him using the map. Now let me ask you this. Do any of you recognize this painting or know where you may have seen it before?
And the movie Lincoln.
Yeah, there you go. Yes, exactly right. It's also at the cover of Team Rivals,
Cool.
Doris Kearns Goodwin book. Unfortunately, it cuts off the
The van.
the slave for our purposes got that got cut off. Also, it's currently on display in U.S. Capitol. So want to see the actual painting? You can go there and look at it because it's
Right.
and our last act.
Doing Jeopardy here.
In March of 1864, General Grant charged all Indian armies, orders General William to come to Sherman and his army to Cumberland to strike against the Confederate Army in Tennessee and western Georgia, and then drive into the interior of Georgia and inflict as much damage as possible. These instructions became the basis for the Atlanta campaign from May to September 1864, which then followed up by Sherman's March to the Sea and the Carolina campaign. That's all outlined in the blue arrows. Now, to execute this campaign, Sherman asked for special maps. Sherman was not just interested in the physical terrain, but he was also interested in its material and human conditions. He pored over the 1860 census, trying to determine where his troops might best forage and survive as he lived off the land. So he consulted with the superintendent of the census, Joseph Kennedy, and asked if he could have maps that showed not just the land, but its people and resources. So Kennedy began to quickly adapt a series of maps that translated the census tabular data into a visual form of a map. Now, we're going to zoom in on this one in a second, but this is one of the maps that was created for General Sherman under the direction of Superintendent Kennedy of the Census Bureau. To get this map compiled quickly, Kennedy used a base map that already existed from 1839 for all of the counties in Alabama and Georgia. This base map included state and county boundaries, townships, railroads, roads, rivers, etc. And on top of this, he put the tabular information from the 1860 census, population data, and agricultural data. So let's go look at that.
From 1839.
That was the base map. So the county boundaries and the, let's say, the natural features all came from 1838. But he superimposed all the information from the 1860 census.
Okay.
And that's what we're going to see. Let's see. There we go. In more detail. So what this actually shows, enlargement of the map for Columbia County. So he was getting, in terms of the population, the white population for Columbia County, 3,511, free colored 56, and slaves 8,293. And then below that are a whole slew of agricultural information, cotton, crops, things like that, that could be used to help Sherman figure out how to provision his troops as they were foraging off the land. So this is sort of a kludge in a way. I mean, this is not as descriptive as the Corpleth maps, in terms of visual impact, but at least you can see on a map, where, what the population figures were for slavery and also for the agricultural information he was interested in. So this was done very quickly by the Census Bureau at the request of General Sherman.
It's so interesting to find this out because so many of those came from West Point, the general.
Oh, yes.
And they knew each other. So they knew each other's strategy and everything. But to be smart enough to start going in the area of, and I'm sure more than him, but to be smart enough to start finding out ways to increase their chance of winning.
Yeah, I mean, and they actually think ahead enough to who would I actually talk to about getting information regarding the human population by county, and including the agricultural information, knowing that there was an 1860 census that gathered such information that was very timely. Sherman was definitely ahead of his time, and it wasn't like they came to him. He asked for it. He went searching it out himself.
Yeah.
So I think you're right about that. I mean, he was very inventive, very creative. And at the end of the war, he actually, after the war was over, he sent this letter, actually got it published in newspapers, because he wanted to show his appreciation of the Census Bureau. And what he said was to operate along lines beyond the possibility of supply from the rear. By means of these maps, I could easily know where the fertile and cultivated lands lay, with their products and animals, grains, etc. So the moment I was prepared to cut loose, I knew exactly where to look for too.
Yeah.
And he doesn't talk here about, the slaves, but the fact of the matter is that everywhere his army went, slaves were liberated. And they had to have some idea of how many they were going to actually be taken care of and provisioning, that kind of thing. So he doesn't mention them here, but again, those are the first figures that were in that map. So, but anyway, just wanted to point out that was General Sherman's assessment of how important those Census Bureau maps were for him. So this is the end. So we've seen numerous maps that were produced and used prior to and during the war. And again, these maps were not neutral. We sort of learned that. Definitely those ones from the 1850s that were produced privately, they definitely had a political theme to them. They had a definite audience they were playing to. And the maps made possible by slave data that was collected by Ismith in 1860 shows the power of data that's collected and how it can be used to actually convey really important information about slavery. And again, the advancement of new cartographic techniques that were developed to map the slave data normally only appears in tables. So this Cornpluck map, again, we see them all the time now, with those legends. 1860, brand new. Nobody ever seen it before. So again, these cartographic techniques were actually designed at the same time to take advantage of the types of data that we were getting from the census. Once you have that really granular information at the county levels, you have something powerful that you can map. So I would have to say that they both work hand in hand. And that is the end. But I also want to give you some of the sources for this. I outlined and read the most important ones. At 6 months at the White House with Abraham Lincoln, you can get that on the web. It's freely available. And if you want to read a pretty entertaining description of what it was like in the Lincoln White House during those 6 months, he's very descriptive. He might be a better writer than Art. I thought his art was great, but he's a great writer. And in Marco Anderson's book on the census, that's really fascinating reading. It covers not just the 1860 census, but all the censuses and how they changed over time, the types of data they were collecting. And Susan Schulten, she's probably I'll call her the queen of mapping American history. That's essentially, she wrote some really groundbreaking articles about, Civil War mapping. Her articles were really helpful. But anyway, as we want to see where this came from, that's the source. And it's a treat. I'm just going to give you, I didn't put there, Eddie.
So it's Francis Bicknell Carter is the one that did the maps that Lincoln.
No, he was the artist who actually described how Lincoln was using the map.
Outstanding.
Yeah, he spent 6 months.
Who was the one who did the?
Edwin Hergesheimer.
Okay.
He was the cartographer for the Coastal Survey.
All right.
Yeah. I'm glad you asked that. A lot of people don't want to remember the cartographer.
I am such a fan.
Okay, good.
That's what I knew when I saw that. I've watched Lincoln 100 times. It's not just because the storyline is so great, but Daniel Day-Lewis was the best Lincoln